when we come to understanding in science, most of the understanding that we have is based upon a motioned existence, movement in space by time, and that this motion in space by time has a connection with energy. So that one of the fundamental bedrock qualities of any kind of mathematical expression that works in contemporary science or contemporary mathematics founds itself upon a ratioable relationship between time, space, and energy. This relationality in a static world is capable of being expressed by the laws of motion developed by Sir Isaac Newton. But fairly early on, it was discovered that there's an alternative way of expressing the laws of motion in a different kind of mentality from Sir Isaac Newton. And a man named Hamilton developed this. And it's called the Hamiltonian interaction. And it turns out later on, after Einstein, after the theory of relativity got going, after quantum physics became operative in dominating the field, that the interactions in terms of Hamiltonian perspective were more exacting and more trustworthy than those of Newton. So very often in contemporary physics or contemporary chemistry or contemporary astronomy, wherever you're dealing with systems in motion, energy systems in motion in space, they will specify interaction Hamiltonian. Or if they don't specify it, they assume it. So we need to position in our understanding a kind of a definition here that we're not just taking movement in a naive way or even in a Newtonian way, but we're taking movement in a Hamiltonian way. And this means that the rates of change in time of physical systems conditions, and physical systems conditions is really tantamount to energy, the change in rates of time and energy together constitute what we would understand as motion. So that time and energy have a relationship, and that relationship is what we recognize as motion, which means that anything extant, anything in existence, is not characterizable by a static checklist. That's not very dependable. Having a static checklist is not very dependable. But having a dynamic checklist, which assumes that there's a fundamental relationship between time, space, energy, and motion, that somehow all of these fit together, they make one snowball. That this is a fundamental assumption and a fundamental foundation upon which science is not only firmly based, that would be an old-fashioned way of speaking. It's not that it's firmly based on that, but that it's able to continue to go based on that. So that there's a dynamic quality to science. And this dynamic quality is not just because it's hip. It's there because that's the only way in which exactness occurs. One of the great examples in 20th century thought is that no matter how smart you are, no matter what kind of intellectual giant you are, you cannot take a static system and put it into motion and expect it to hold up. The greatest example of this is the famous German philosopher Martin Heidegger, who tried to write a whole new cosmological ontology, that is to say, a study of being, in the 1920s because of all these changes in mathematics and physics and so forth. And he sought at that time to write the book in two basic parts. The first part would be a complete exacting expression of the system in its stasis, what it is, and then in the second part of the book to put it in motion and transcribe those exacting conditions and definitions into their motion quality. By 1927, he had finished the first part, and he called the book Being and Time. He never finished it, even though he lived another half century. He lived another 50 years. He was unable to complete that project because the methodology was faulty. Now, one of the bugbears of 20th century philosophy is that many people who had a kind of theological leaning, or on the other side, a kind of existentialist leaning, or a variant of existentialism called phenomenology. People who were into theology, into existentialism, into phenomenology, assumed that Heidegger knew what he was doing and that Being and Time was a great book and that they were able to finish it by developing their systems, their application dynamic systems, and a great deal of 20th century philosophical thought is actually irrelevant, is extraneous, because there is no way structurally to take a static description of something and consider it absolute and then put it into motion and come out with some exactness in terms of relativity. The upshot of it is, from the beginning, one has to work with dynamics. So the whole process of hopefully that there's some accurate way to reduce everything down to a picture is the wrong methodology. It doesn't work, and even if you could do it, you wouldn't get any results that you could trust. Which means that we have to do an about face. We have to face another direction. And the other direction is that if you start dynamically, where do you begin? Because if it's a dynamic, well, then it's ongoing, right? And the resolution by the best minds of the generation before us was based on this Hamiltonian interaction. That instead of taking things in dynamic, one takes whole systems in their dynamic. If you take a system in its dynamic, it's actually easier to work with than by taking things dynamically and trying to find out how two things dynamically work together. The basic problem in taking systems in dynamic from the beginning is that suppose that you have two systems dynamically. How do you relate anything in one system to another? Because if you can take two systems and relate something in the first system to something in the second system, then no matter how many systems there are, no matter how complex it is, it's a variation of this technique. Now, the guy who solved this problem, his name was Lorentz, the stubborn Dutchman, which you might surmise. And the relationality is called the Lorentz transformations. And it's one of the most indispensable things in modern science. And Lorentz, in developing his transformations, realized that if you have basically two systems or more, and they move with a constant motion relative to each other, you don't have to pay any attention whatsoever to the absolute perimeter within which they move, as long as there is some tether that is constant. In other words, you don't have to know the shape of the universe exactly in order to relate two systems moving within the universe, as long as there's a tether to constancy someplace in the systems which they share, and that tether in the Lorentz transformations is the speed of light. That no matter how many systems there are, in each and all of them, that's logically the way to say it, I think, in each and all of them, the speed of light will always be the same constant. The only question was, is that true? And the main objection was very simple. If everything is relative, how do you know that the speed of light is not a relativity factor that just reoccurs in all the systems that we have, that we can imagine, that we're in some kind of a condition perimeter where we cannot tell? And so one had to establish that the speed of light is constant independent of any observer. And that was established. It was complex, but nevertheless it was established. And so that aspect, the fact that the speed of light is always going to be a trustworthy tether, it's always going to be a constant. No matter what kind of dynamic is going on, no matter how many systems, but fundamentally we'll take the case of two systems, that the speed of light will be constant in both of them. And because of that, the Lorentz transformations can be trusted, and the basis upon which that trust in those transformations is positioned, that basis was called the Lorentz invariant. And the Lorentz invariant has three basic qualities to it. First, that inertial systems of reference actually exist. Well, why is that important? Because if you're dealing with a dynamic system, you need to know that this dynamic system moves. It has existential qualities of energy. It abides in time-space, differentially against a background which is not subsumed in that system. So that in an inertial background of reference must exist. In other words, you can't have an is without an isn't, against which the is can be defined and observed and formed. And the whole purpose of all this is to gain insight into how to speak and give form to shapes of existence which we can trust. There's a whole basis of science. We would like to know, but whatever we need to know, we need to have a language which can characterize the shapes of is in terms of a background of the shapelessness of isn't. So the Lorentz invariant is that these backgrounds exist, and they don't have any shape, they don't have any dynamic, and yet they do exist. The second quality in this is that systems differ by motion, and that this is capable of being characterized as a constant differentiation. That the differentiation will hold. That doesn't mean that they will always be different, but that the differential can be calculated, it can be calibrated, it can be computed, and will always have this Lorentz transformational bridging, but they will always be different, two different systems at least. The third is that the method of calculation that can be trusted to hold this together is in fact the Lorentz transformations. So it's like the noble threefold path of the Buddha, right? That isn'ts really aren't, right? Because if isn'ts are in some weird way, we're in deep trouble. Because their are-ness is going to affect our is's in ways that we will never be able to figure out. Okay, so is-nots exist. Or if you have a t-shirt, isn'ts do it. That the systems differ by motion in a constantly differential way, and that the Lorentz transformations, that the rates of change in time of physical system conditions or energy relate together. What all this means is that modern science, contemporary science, has a way of talking about existence that cannot be diluted even if the worst possible scenario were the case. And what is the worst possible scenario? 1,000 years ago, medieval philosophy posited an unspeakable idea which they managed to mumble out. And that is, what if God is really an evil genius? If God is an evil genius, we are made to be deceived permanently without knowing that we're made to be deceived. And there's no way that we could ever wheedle out of that, because that's how we're made. That's the worst possible scenario. Contemporary science has resolved that possibility completely forever. Because even if we are in a defective universe, a la Gnosticism, even if God were an evil genius, even if there were no capacity in us to resolve things to truth, nevertheless, this methodology, by taking dynamic patterns that have relationalities between them because of a constant tether that has nothing to do with any of the conditioned systems themselves, all of this holds together. All right? What's the drawback? What's the catch? The catch is that it's god-awful complicated to keep in mind. Nobody can keep this in mind. Because every time we try to think about it, we try to think about it with a mind that's not used to that. Used to what? Our minds are made on a planetary environment. We're made to respond to things in a gravity field. We're made to respond to things vis-a-vis one sun. We're made to respond to things vis-a-vis one moon. There are all kinds of limiting factors in the condition in which not only we were born, but our species was made and the whole life process developed. So the only way to be able to think truly rationally is to abstract ourselves from our natural situation completely, even though that may be a temporary situation for an hour or two, for a day or two, for a few people in their career. Nevertheless, we have to have that capacity. Without that capacity, the very nature of differential consciousness involutes itself automatically and regresses back further than it was before. Now, this process is well known in wisdom traditions. The process is very simple. Somebody who starts on a wisdom path, the first time that they have doubt, the first time that they stop the continuity of pursuit along or movement along that path, they automatically, subconsciously begin to devolve. And the devolution works with the same energy as the evolution. And one ends up further back than one began. Where does one end up? It's because of this educational pattern that one can calibrate expressively where one ends up. Let's see how it works. Integration proceeds, and its initial point is not a point at all, but is a matrix of change. The Lorentz transformations only work in matrix Hamiltonian interaction system. If you choose some other way of expressing it, even if it's like Sir Isaac Newton, it's just not going to work. Okay? So one has to begin with matrix expressions. That is, instead of saying that something exists here in space, one has to bring a fourth dimension of time into the coordinates, and all four of those have to be expressed together as a set, as a matrix, and you can generally write them in like Chinese characters from top to bottom. So if you're going to characterize where this is, it not only has the three dimensions of space, it has the fourth dimension of time. So that matrix within brackets would have, if it were imaginary, it would have 0, 0, 0, 0. But if it were in a temporality of some existential, like myself, imagining it, it would not be in space, but it would have a time designate. You could give it 0, 0, 0, 1. So that all extant things now are characterized differently than the natural object which you can point to or tap. They now are characterizable in a mental space, in a conscious vision, with much more accuracy, but that the accuracy uses a language not of the finger to point or to tap, but uses a locus of visionary focus. The important thing is that the visionary focus not be an image, but be a structural location. If I have an image of 0, 0, 0, 1 with a bracket around it, I have made a fundamental error. I have regressed. I've gone back to an imaging rather than a symbolic visioning. Why would I do that? Because that is the automatic watershed in a devolution versus evolution sequence. Why is that so? Our education begins in nature, which is a matrix of change, and does not have any kind of palpability at that level, so that the structure of this course, mirroring reality, begins without staticness and begins just with dynamic change. The second season of the course, the second part of the course, ritual, is where existence happens, where bodies begin to occur. And those who have been through it, or those who are going to come through it, starting in April of '96, you'll see that existence, the body, is characterized by the brute fact that only when action occurs does existence posit itself into what we would call things. This is why rituals always involve movement. They always involve action. They always involve doing something. And it's what you do that creates the existence. So that nature doesn't exist, but is real. And ritual exists within the context, within the matrix of the reality of nature. So at the first level of there-ness is on ritual. The first firmness, the first graspability is on ritual level. It's very important. And it always involves the body, and it always involves a doing which is repeatable, which is categorically able to be finalized into some kind of habit, into some kind of ceremony, into some kind of tradition. And it's absolutely necessary that this be so. That ritual level calls out all by itself the need for a language. And the language is like a glue that helps the existence stick together. The body calls out by its own existence the need for a language. I mean, hit your finger with a hammer. No one taught you to make that ouch or that cuss or whatever it is. I mean, just it happened. Surprise any existent thing that has any capacity for sound. It's like on that level. Language characterizes experience, which is it's like a cloud, and that cloud surrounds that mountain of existence. Whenever anything exists, whenever it protrudes out of nature into existence, it has this atmosphere of experience that begins to collect around it, just like clouds forming around a mountain. And that's how language works. Notice here that language is very similar to nature in that it doesn't need to be extant to work. It needs to be real to work. So languages are real, but not necessarily based on existence. Words are not things. Words are in motion. They're process of change. Language is also a matrix of change. The simple way of saying this is that all viable languages are living, or all living languages are viable in the sense that they adapt. A dead language is one that no longer is able to adapt, that's no longer characterizing experience, but has fallen into a ritual, frozen, deep freeze. And there are languages like that. Cuneiform. No one speaks cuneiform. No one speaks the language that was expressed in written terms by cuneiform. is a dead language. If someone learns cuneiform in 1850, it's going to be the same language that somebody in 2750 would learn. It's left there. And cuneiform as a language was it's an interesting example because it's the first time that a written language developed in terms of the graspable pliability of man. All of the original cuneiform tablets were palm-sized. They were pieces of clay that were pounded to fit the palm. They're small enough to go on the palm. They're kind of rounded. So the written form of cuneiform was literally writing on the palm of your hand. So that was a graspable language, because it was one of the earliest examples of a written language, and it's very precarious for an existential-based being to begin the excursions of flying in the hyperspace of experience, so they needed to be grounded. We need to have it right here. So that later on, when more sophisticated languages developed, at the time that cuneiform was being formed, the earliest form of Greek was called Linear A. And when Linear A was written, it was very similar to cuneiform. It was like little scratches that were always the same. But Linear A transformed through experience into Linear B, and Linear B transformed through further experience into ancient archaic Greek, and that Greek into a better Greek, and finally it became a classical Greek. But even at the stage of Plato with classical Greek, when someone was giving a progression of experience that led to an idea, the gesture, the ritual gesture that was used was always this. Do you get it? Do you grasp it? And so one used this kind of language. Do you grasp the idea? Do you get the idea? Because the idea exists on a different level. It exists. Notice the word. It exists, but on a different level from experience. It exists on the mind level. So that you have nature, which is a process. You have ritual, which is a thing, a level where things can be, where existence can be. Then you have myth, which is again another process. And then you have the mind, the symbol level, which again has existence. So the body and the mind, the ritual and the symbol levels always have existence. But in fact, they're equally, it's strange to say equally real. All four of those are real. But the body and the mind have existence in the same kind of way. What kind of way? The dynamic way of saying that they have existence is that they are alchemical precipitations of the process. The body is a positing of the alchemy of nature. The matrix of change of nature works in such a way that one of the precipitations is this body. The alchemy of language is in such a way that one of the precipitations is this mind. So that the body becomes existent, it precipitates out of nature. The mind precipitates out of language, out of experience. The body deals with the world that experience characterizes. So the body, in a way, is a mediating bridge between nature and the world. It's like a a magical mystery tour sandwich. We're here in between two oceans that are constantly scintillating. And it doesn't bother us at all because our here-ness guarantees that they're related together. The ocean of language and the ocean of nature never bother us at all that they are vast beyond belief. Because our body is existentially just and only and exactly what it is. And it guarantees that we'll be able to handle it. And no matter how vast the ocean of nature is, no matter how vast the ocean of language is, they only come together for us in terms of this body, and we can manage that. We can itch it, we can shampoo it, we can work with that. Consciousness is another process. It's another ocean. It's a third ocean. Consciousness is like nature. It's like language. And we call it vision. And the ocean of vision is vast. It has an ability, just like nature precipitates bodies, just like language precipitates minds. Visionary consciousness precipitates persons. So the person in no way is a thing. Person in no way is in the natural cycle of things. No way is characterized in its reality by language. What is the person? The person's existence characterized by the focus of integration that becomes the seed of differentiation. So that the person is an existential form in a differential mode of energy. In no way are we natural. No way at all. Nor are we mental. To the same extent that we're not ritually bound, we are also not mentally bound. No way. But because the person, as a differential form, has existence only because differential forms exist. What would be a good differential form? Like a prism. Instead of a dot, a prism. So a person always has a spectrum of possibility, and it's the spectrum as a whole that is the existential there-ness. Notice that there's a fourth ocean. That just like nature and language were oceans in integration, in differentiation, there are two oceans too. The first is visionary consciousness, but the second is history. History in no way is the simplistic thing that is assumed by shoddy education. No way at all. Has nothing to do. Those are fantasies. They're not only misconceptions, erroneous, but they are radically wrong. They're structurally wrong. They don't operate that way at all. So that in order to deal realistically with history, one has to go, like modern physics, to Hamiltonian interactions. One has to deal with whole systems. And within those systems, there has to be some kind of constant, which is trustworthy. What is the trustworthy constant? Like the speed of light. In historical ocean between dynamical systems. The constant is the focus of realization. The equanimity of realization is always trustworthy. One can always trust that that is independently absolute and independently real. Which means that dealing with the process of history involves a really enlightened remembrance on the part of any participant, of any observer, without which one is not only lost, one is completely baffled, and baffled in a radical way. Not only is the content all erroneous, but the structure also is erroneous. The very energy mode is erroneous. And just as the ocean of language posits bodies, and the ocean of language posits minds, and the ocean of consciousness posits persons, the ocean of history posits a cosmos. The cosmos is existential because the process of history posits it and guarantees it, just like nature guarantees the body, just like language guarantees the mind, or consciousness guarantees the person. A history which is real guarantees that the cosmos exists. Let's substitute a word that theology likes: heaven. Heaven only exists if the Lord of history is operable. That's the way the old theology used to be stated. When God is the Lord of history, then heaven really exists, certainly is there. But is only there if that matrix of change called history is able to be navigated in terms of realistic dynamic systems. In the matrix of change, which is history, what are the forms that come out? The forms that come out are all time forms. Time forms. So that one has to learn to deal with time forms, just like one has to learn to deal with drums and feathers on ritual level. On science level, one has to deal with time forms, and time forms happen to be related to space. They're actually time-space forms. And those time-space forms are always related to energy, and that time-space energy interface always is in a motion, in a dynamic systems of existence. Now, from what I'm saying, you can see it's very complex to think one's way, and that if you're dependent on using a mind that pictures, you get left behind because there's no way to picture this. What we've been doing here is using a schemata, a kind of a language diagrammatic ability, as aiding consciousness, but I've shown you no images. Some hand gestures, facial expressions, but no show and tell, no images. If the person doesn't come together, if the prism doesn't work, what happens to the spectrum? If you have a misformed prism, you don't get the spectrum, but you get some kind of crimped, inarticulate version of it. Or you get no spectrum at all. You just get fragmentation. Which means that for that being, the process of history doesn't even happen, and there's no possibility for heaven whatsoever. That's like really being damned. Not just from the get-go, but before the get-go is even initiated. Now that kind of condition is intolerable to heaven. Because not only does that being not have a chance to be in heaven, but heaven doesn't really have any existence whatsoever. Because of that being not being able to get to heaven. Heaven doesn't really exist. So you think God's going to take that laying down? No. Going to fight. Because it's even worse than that. If we don't move forward, we move back. And if we move back to the last stable level. Now, if the person doesn't gel, it's because the mind was unclear. Because if the mind has focused integration, the person is there without effort. You don't have to struggle. You don't have to push the river. But if the person doesn't gel, if the person isn't existentially operable and there, it's because the mind didn't really focus in a centered way. And so the symbol level that would be stable in the mind doesn't work as a net, doesn't catch the regression. So where does the regression go? It can't go to stop in language because language is just a matrix of change. So where does it stop? It stops in the body. Heart attack. That's how it happens. The body receives the burden which is not made to carry. And it X's out. Number one cause of death in the universe? Regressive differentiation that overloads the integral circuits. Take a break. Let's see how this works out. We've been talking rather theoretically. The other side of theory is practice. That is to say, there's always a pair, and the pair with theory is practice. How does this work out in practice? Let's look at something which is extremely practical, the cell. Here we have Molecular Biology of the Cell, 3rd edition, one of our textbooks. And on page 92, let's take a paragraph. The paragraph is titled, like all the paragraphs that collect together into subsections here, this title is Diffusion is the first step to molecular recognition. We're talking about cells, and within cells there are atoms, atomic structures of elements, and those elements come together into molecules, and it's the molecules that are the stuff that the cell deals with. How can it deal with things unless it can recognize what it is? That's very practical. Every cell and every organic organism on the planet utilizes this practical application of what we were talking about this morning. So if you think it's complicated, that's too damn bad. Every cell. Here's how it reads. Before two molecules can bind to each other, notice no organic processes would happen at all in any kind of directed way unless molecules can recognize each other. Do they carry spec sheets around in their pockets? Let's see. Who are you? It's not a question of spec sheets. It's that the dynamic process is a system that has everything built in. It's a self-organizing system. Molecules, atoms, organisms, glands, heaven, all self-organizing systems. Before two molecules can bind to each other, they must come into close contact. This is achieved by the thermal motions Thermal is heat. If it's absolute cold, they're not going to move. If it's 1 Kelvin, they quiver. This is achieved by the thermal motions that cause molecules to wander or diffuse from their starting positions. Doesn't matter where they are to begin with, they're going to move, and the movement is diffusion, and the diffusion takes a very specific, repeatable path. How do they move? Two molecules will seek each other out by a movement known as random walk. The path described figure 3.5. You can focus in here in the bottom of the page on the left where the little finger is. Let's read how it reads in the text. As the molecules in a liquid rapidly collide and bounce off one another, an individual molecule moves first one way and then another, its path constituting a random walk. See figure 3.5. Figure 3.5 illustrating a random walk, this zigzag pattern. Molecules in solution move in random fashion due to the continual buffeting they receive in collisions with other molecules. So that the path of a random walk is characteristic of the way in which molecules work in the process organically within every cell. Notice that in the very beginning of this education, the very first assignment, the very first project is to take a random walk. Now, there is a mathematics, has a whole literature. Here's the American Institute of Physics. Random walks and their applications in physical and biological sciences, 1984. Or, here's a Princeton University Press paperback, Random Walks in Biology. So there's a madness in this method. Why does this education begin with the I Ching and Thoreau? And what of Thoreau do we begin with his essay Walking? And the I Ching deals with change. We deal with walking in a matrix of change. Where would we find the conditions for a walk in a matrix of change? We would find it wherever we live, by stepping out the front door and just going for a while and coming back. Now, noting when you take the first step is crucial, and noting when you take the last step is salvational. The initial and the final steps are a pair. Just like eventually, on the highly differential conscious cosmic level, creation and annihilation are a pair. In the depths of nuclear physics and the highest math available, creation and annihilation are always paired together, and it's the only way that we are able to move at all. Remember last week we were talking about how all of theoretical physics has a peculiar quality in that it deals with delineation of particles because of collisions. They call these great accelerators particle accelerators. And why do they accelerate these particles? To get collisions at higher and higher energy. If you have something like the Bevatron in Berkeley up in the hills, it's was fairly large for its time when E.O. Lawrence built it, and if you stand above it and are fortunate to be able to see it uncovered for a fraction of a minute, one sees this very eerie blue light, because the nuclear interactions produce a very eerie blue light. It's a soft robin's egg blue, but with an intensity that's startling. But all physics deals with collisions. We don't have a physics that deals with non-collisions. There's no physics, to use the term that we used a couple of weeks ago, vis-a-vis Feynman. There's no non-perturbative mathematics and physics yet. Whereas in the 21st century, there will be developed a non-perturbative physics. Not a physics based on particles and fragments that come out of collisions, but out of the exactness of consciously being able to frame the existence non-perturbatively of non-destroyed atoms, non-destroyed particles. There's a whole different level of consciousness. It's a level of consciousness is different from children learning by breaking things as children learning by getting into the reality of how they are when they are what they are. There's a whole different consciousness coming. There's no way to get there. That population of beings on this planet do not exist yet. About 2-3 generations away. No one is ever going to get there without a bridge. And the bridge is an educational series of transformations that are absolutely essential. Otherwise, it won't even exist. And that's why all this work, the only reason for this Jacob's ladder. There's no other reason to do it. There are plenty of other things to do. But that heaven will not exist. Those men and women will never mature. And the children for thousands of years afterwards will be in regressive hells that are unimaginably painful. So that's why all this work. You have other things to do? These random walks take place within a reality, the structure of which can be known. That structure can be knowable if we characterize in terms of matrices rather than in terms of things that we can point at. A matrix which can be focused in a mental, symbolic way can bridge over into visionary consciousness and come out of the integral mode of energy and into the differential. Symbols and vision make a bridge. And the only way over that bridge, the most ancient characterization of this is from ancient Iran, from Zarathustra, about 4,200 years ago. And we're given to understand at that time, the wisdom tradition, that this bridge narrows rapidly, and so much so that it becomes a razor edge that becomes so fine that there's no way to go over it with anything other than a guide which moves us in one continuous motion effortlessly without touching it. And that guide, in ancient Zarathustrian vision, was a woman. Her name was Daina. And she's the spirit guide, and this bridge was called the Chinvat Bridge. And the only way out of coming together into going open is to go over that Chinvat Bridge with a spirit guide. And that spirit guide later on became the anima, became the soul, became the spirit helper, became the guardian spirit, became the template out of which angels were imaged. All angels originate in that figure some 4,200 years ago. Before that, there were none. There are no Paleolithic angels, kiddos. This matrix, which is a conscious focus, cannot exist as a thing. Otherwise, it would have a regressive property. It would be an image only, and its viability would be in reference to something other than itself. It would be representational. Whereas the viability of consciousness is that it doesn't represent, but it presents. And the initial trigger in that realization is on the level of the mind. As long as the mind is deluded, it believes that by accepting a representational sequence, that it's safe. Whereas the mind, every time it accepts a representational sequence, it subconsciously devolves back into ritual level. It abides on that stability. And the more that happens, the more it closes a rut of regressibility, and the more that one becomes absolutely glued into doing things only this way. That's the essence of tyranny. It doesn't matter if it's an ideological tyranny like fascism. It doesn't matter if it's a religious tyranny like we've seen many times, or on every level. A bad mother, a bad father, a bad ego, any ego. All of those are de-evolutionary regressions that go back on that level. And there is no way to countermand that within the regressive circle. The ecology of regression does not permit any variation to cancel out the prime directive. The way you do it is that you recalibrate from a beginning before all of that happens. And then you carry someone through that problematical level. You carry them through that rutted circle level with a recalibration that does not permit this kind of imprisonment to occur. And that's how you free someone. Because if the imprisonment conditions do not occur, they're not going to be jailed. And the good thing is that it's only a temporary phase. The bad thing is that the phase is indefinite unless you can go across the ocean of language. And that's why there are magical symbols at the very origins of written language to help get you across the netherworld, to help get you into heaven, get you reborn into a new day with Ra, or whatever level you want to get to. But there is a bridging that is necessary, and that bridging requires a transformation. And the transformation means that the frames of reference have to change their structure. They can't remain the same. What structure do they have? They have to have an integral structure up to a vanishing point, and then they must have a differential structure. And a differential series works only by freedom. Only by freedom does the person have any reality within which to exist, and only by freedom of the individuals actually existing does heaven have any verifiability whatsoever. Why does God love free persons? Because they go together. They are both real together. Neither is real without the other. That's how it works. And not understanding that is naive. And teaching something other than that is misinformed. Now, when we come back to look at the way in which languages, differential languages, express how energy, how movement, how time, how space, how forms operate, we find again and again, like this little handful of books, we find the same kind of language used just in the titles. We don't have to go any deeper than that. Titles of 5 books from late 20th century mathematics. This one is called Vectors and Matrices. Vectors and Matrices. This one is called Abstract Set Theory. This one is called Set Theory. This one is called Elementary Matrices. And notice, Sets and Matrices. And this one is called Operator Algebras in Dynamical Systems. The Theory of Unbounded Derivations in C Algebras. C asterisk algebra. So that operator algebras in dynamic systems. Notice how mathematical language is a differential language. Whereas cuneiform was a mythic language that in terms of history regressed and froze itself on ritual level. Greek was a language that developed into symbolic power and was able to project itself into vision. And that vision was so powerful that persons actually formed out of that, individual persons. There's nothing tribal about Aeschylus or Pindar. It's harder than hell to translate Pindar's poetry because his poetry does sudden ascents and veers that tribal language can't do. It would fall apart. In terms of analogous, the best that tribal language can do is horseback, whereas Pindar's jet pilot. He does things with Greek syntax that changed the language forever. It made it so subtle and supple that later on one could have somebody like Euripides able to look at what he was saying while he was saying it and see that he was trapped in something that was tragic. He was trapped in a mode that was out of date that he couldn't get rid of. And knew that all the forms built on that basis were doomed. And that's why in ritual we use Euripides the Bacchae. But we pair Euripides the Bacchae with the Buddha's mindful sutra, Satipatthana Sutra. Sutra doesn't mean doctrine, it means thread. It means that if you follow this thread, even if it takes a random walk pattern, it will have a starting place. It will have whatever development randomly is going to happen, and it will have a terminal place. It would have an initial and a terminal. It'll have a creation and annihilation. That within the chance, so-called randomness, will be a form which has a parenthetical definiteness which is mathematically determinable. That the worst threat, what's worse than death for tribal man? Madness. Death they can work in richly. Madness they can't work it in. You can bury the dead. You can do all sorts of things. You can fear them. Madness, whereas the differential consciousness, once it's really operative, can work madness in easily. How? Watch the Marx Brothers. No problem. There were no Marx Brothers in cuneiform times. I mean, you can see that truth verifies itself without you having to struggle, right? If we have a differential system, all we need to do to be able to navigate is to be able to pair at least 2 systems together and tie some way of correlation between the two systems, and all we need is one tether to do that. The time-honored tether is light. It's not a metaphysical statement. It has nothing to do with metaphysics. It has to do with theoretical physics, not metaphysics, but theoretical physics. Now, meta is Greek, and theory is Greek. Physis is Greek. It's all Greek language terms. What do they mean? Meta means something which is above. Above in a very special way. Above in a squared kind of a way. 4 is like a meta state of 2. It's 2 squared. It's above in that way. It has an integral ratio. So it's something that's meta. A metaphysics always is worked out in terms of a scaffolding, and the scaffolding is always in terms of an integration. Always. Whereas a theory, theoria doesn't mean above. Theory means contemplation within, to level of equanimity. It means a within seeing with equanimity, so that instead of seeing in terms of some kind of lattice, some kind of ladder, one sees in terms of the entirety of the pattern. So a metaphysics is immediately out of date the first time that any theoretical conscious atom comes into play. It doesn't matter how sophisticated a metaphysics is, it is immediately eclipsed by the very first initial point in a theoria. It's the best iodine for soreness in the universe. One drop of consciousness takes away the soreness of egotistical metaphysics. Instantly. Even in Colombia. Even in Von Valdez, picking the ripe beans on the mountain in Colombia. It's a quality which not only works, but doesn't work. And when it doesn't work as well as it does work. Which is to say, you go down as fast as you go up. And the energy used is the same. The energy for regression is indistinguishable from the energy of salvation. So if you're using soporifics to X out the energy so you don't feel the regression, you're also Xing out the energy that would be used for getting free. So you get into one of these intolerable binds. Characterized, let's see, when was it characterized? It was characterized 2,030 years ago in Rome. The statement was, we cannot stand the diseases that our society has manufactured for us, and we're not strong enough to withstand the cure. That's a terrible bind. The only way out of that bind is to go back before the entire ensemble of forms is made and recalibrate, come up through it. Now, anybody can regress back to nature. Anybody can go native. Why? Because we're a part of the matrix of nature. It's a given. Anybody can just fall back into nature. How do you do that? Go to sleep. Okay? You want to argue about that? The problem is how do you come back up recalibrated through the various levels? That's what an education is for. Anybody can fall asleep, but it takes an education to come back through recalibrated. Otherwise, you wake up to the same damn problems forever. There's no limit, and that's the hell of it. There's no time limit, there's no space limit at all. It's a closed circle. But fortunately, the closed circle is only one particle thick. It's not a brick wall at all. And all you need is one prick from one needle, and the whole thing collapses. It's just that you have to be ready to accept the fact that the whole thing is collapsed and not you. Because if you've identified yourself with it, if you've identified yourself with the sheen of your image on the inside surface of that bubble, and that bubble goes, you think, well, I've gone crazy. And that's exactly what Euripides talks about in the Bacchae. You haven't gone crazy. What has happened is that the ego projection belief has been scrambled, and that is quite different from you. And if you will just wait 1 nanosecond, it'll pass. If you don't right away scramble for some cure, for some pill, for some drug, it'll pass. And it passes right through. Because it has no staying power. An illusion, once it's gone, fades remarkably fast. Why? Because nature has, on very confidential, secret basis, tremendous capacity for diffusion, but that the diffusion doesn't work very well over long distances, but works very well over short distances. So that in nature, diffusion works on very, very small distances and not very well on larger distances. And that's why you need a transformation, so that differentiation works magnetically over whole cosmoses. How short is the operable space of diffusion? Let's continue the paragraph of molecular biology of the cell. Diffusion is the first step to molecular recognition. Before two molecules can bind to each other, they must come into close contact. This is achieved by the thermal motions that cause molecules to wander or diffuse from their starting positions. As the molecules in a liquid rapidly collide and bounce off one another, an individual molecule moves first one way and then another, its path constituting a random walk. The average distance that each type of molecule travels from its starting point is proportional to the square root of the time involved. Why is it proportional to the square root of the time? Because the power of the structure of conscious vision, using its theoretical language, can characterize very aptly in an indexing way the whole ecology of integration. And it works that way. For instance, if it takes a particular molecule 1 second on average to go 1 unit, it will move 2 units in 4 seconds, 2 times 2. It will move 10 units in 100 seconds, 10 squared. So that the squaring, think of a square. Now think of 2 sides of the square. That's what the square means. The inverse proportional is that the movement, the time-space motion vis-a-vis the energy, is always this squared quality. Why is it that way? Because the structure of nature, when it comes into existence, certifies that that form is stable and other variants of it are not stable. They don't obtain. So that even in something that isn't linear, like a human body, that inverse proportional correlation, language is apt, can characterize it. And you're not deluding yourself. But you're also not participating in a metaphysics, but in a theoretical physics. In this case, a theoretical microbiology. But the beautiful thing in science is that a theoretical differentiation will always be exactly paired with a practical differentiation. In other words, experiment will always square up with, match up with the theory if it's real. You will be able to have an experiment in practice that will reflect, will double up the theoretical expression. And just as the language that's used for the theoretical expression to express its structure in consciousness, one will be able to measure with the same language, the same calibration, the same indexing, will be able to measure the experiment. So that theory and experiment in a differential consciousness are always a pair. And this pairedness is talked about in terms of theoretical physics. Often the term used is parity. Parity. Reality will always have parity, and a theory will always have parity with an experiment. And if they do, if they have that kind of jibe, one can then trust that. Because the very nature of transformation requires that one of the constituents of conditions that must hold, it's called a reflected space. Another is change. Change must be real. Reflected space must be real. Are these so? Yes, it's verifiable again and again. How is it verifiable? It's verifiable because the parity is achieved each and every time. So that diffusion is therefore, coming back to this paragraph in Molecular Biology of the Cell, the concluding sentence, diffusion is therefore an efficient way for molecules to move limited distances, but an inefficient way for molecules to move long distances. So that in the molecular biology of the cell works very efficiently, with great efficiency. It works efficiently with great efficiency. That's a Groucho Marx lyric, right? But it can't do much beyond its reach. So if you pray to the cells to get you a job, they're not going to be able to respond very well. It's right? That's crazy. Because they can't get you a job doesn't mean that those cells are mean or bad or evil. That's the whole meaning of proportion. That's why in science one has to deal with proportion, and proportion is always ratios of the real. So that the existence of a problem does not necessarily entail a solution must exist also, because the problem may be a metaphysical problem for which there is no match. Whereas if it is a theoretical problem, there will be a match. There will be a practical application and you can do something about it. Which means you can find out by observing what happens. It's the old story. If you're hungry, don't imagine a piece of pie. Go and find a piece of pie and eat it. It's that kind of thing. Images are not a trustworthy source of verification. And the ego lives in a world of images. It must. It has to. Doesn't make the ego evil. It just means that it's like the cell. It's operable on a limited locality, and that's what it's made for. It's made to navigate in rooms, not in universes. It's made to go from one hut to another. It means that you can go from this hut to that field and endure it, even though it's harder than hell. But egos cannot go to another star system or even to another planet or even to the moon. An illusionary world like the Soviet Union was never able to go to the moon. Now, there's no technical reason why they couldn't. Right? I mean, they had every capacity to go to the moon. They never went to the moon. And even now, there are no Russians that have ever gone to the moon, much less Soviets. Because the Russians now are living in a derivation illusion from the Soviet Union. I think they're a truncated version of the Soviet Union. The Soviet Union was a projected bubble of Tsarist Russia expansionism. It doesn't matter what size the Soviet Union is, that world is an illusion. Now, there's no way that Russians are impaired because somebody like a Kandinsky or a Chagall, two perfectly good Russians, could easily have gone to the moon. Stravinsky, easily. Not only the moon, not only other star systems, but anywhere in the universe. You think Stravinsky was not going to wear his spats anywhere he wanted to? It's not limited at all. It's not because the Russians are limited when they are real, when their persons are there, but it's that within an egotistical world bubble, the movement is too slow, too limited to carry into reality. Cannot happen. So the Russians, the Soviets are super champions of going into orbit and going around the Earth. Years on end, right? You could have Soviet Russians in orbit forever, and they would always be able to do that, but ask them, will you, for Lenin's sake, please go to the moon so we can get this over with? They will not do it. They don't have what Zorba said was indispensable, right? A man needs a little madness, otherwise he never dares cut and be free. Why? Because a frozen society like the Soviet Union, a static mentality like Tsarist Russia, is frozen on ritual level, and ritual level is only operable in reconfirming that what you did before is what we're going to do next. There's no freedom. In fact, freedom is an enemy. They circle your name. They put you in Siberia. They don't let you go to the United States. All kinds of things. And they tell other peoples, well, you are now Soviets. As if after 50 years of shouting at Lithuanians are suddenly going to be Soviets. Were they? No. As if 100 years of exiling prisoners to Siberia made Siberia a prison. Do you think that the modern people in Irkutsk feel like prisoners? Not just Yevtushenko, but anybody. Any fashionable Siberian woman walking on the streets of Irkutsk is not waiting for some Muscovite to tell her what she can do. It's as simple as that. It's as radical as that. And yet, with all that simplicity and radicalness, why does an education like this not obtain? Because it's new. And because it has the two ritual characterizations of something new. First, it's not new, and second, it's not true. It's always like that. It always will be like that. So there needs to be a bridging. But that bridging takes a transformation out of frames of image reference into presentations of focus, presence. There was a beautiful little sociological book by a man named Irving Goffman, The Presentation of Self in Everyday Life. It was a remarkable little book. The presentation of self in everyday life is very difficult to do, because anytime you really present yourself, your personhood in everyday life, people will cringe from you, will chip away at you, and you will be an alien in terms of the situation that they expect. Because the expectation is always on a traditional, reductive, ritual basis that the mythic world is going to work in such and such a way, and that there are limits beyond which you cannot go. Or you will be arrested and deported, bound and gagged, or eliminated. This is true on the level of physiology. It is not just an artifact of sociological constructs, but is true in terms of organisms. So that built into the very matrix of nature is spirit right from the beginning. Spirit is not something developed later on. It was there initially, all the time. Otherwise, spirit, consciousness, because of its radical nature, would not only be antithetical to the worlds made by tribal egotism for their necessary survival, but nature would reject it too. And so one has to ask, does the matrix of nature reject the cosmos of differential consciousness? Does nature, qua nature, reject heaven? And the last lecture of the series is all about that. Next week for Science 12, we're going to take a look more at the molecular biology of the cell. See if you can acquaint yourself with the way in which a membrane of a cell is structured. Try to find that out. Do the cells have little black lines drawn around them by nature? And then nature sketches in the stuff in? Get curious. Just how does that work? You could find out by consulting molecular biology of the cell. In the index, notice that unlike a scroll, a book, a codex can be indexed. And you could look up under membrane. Or you could read, there are lots of books on membranes. One of the best we have here, I'll set on the table, is called The Lively Membrane. All of the structural reality in the organic world is based on a peculiar parity of water in the structure of the membrane of cells. And without that parity, there would be no way that cells would be able to exist. But their existence is purely on the basis of a theoretical structure that is not necessary in integration, but is necessary in differentiation. The mystery of water and membrane in cells is only knowable to a differential consciousness, is never even identifiable in terms of integration. So if you're limiting yourself all the time by integration, you're never going to get to the knowing of something extremely important and fundamental, like how do cells become cells and stay cells and work as cells. Next week. Thanks.